We'll go ahead and get started. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our session today. We are grateful to have with us today some legal professionals to talk to us about the reopening of the church. We know that day is coming. As it relates to the General Baptist State Convention, we are still recommending compliance with the governor's order. There was an injunction put in place, and now faith organizations have the option to have a worship service as they see fit. But again, our recommendations as far as from the convention's perspective is that you maintain the stay order and to follow the recommendations of our governor. We know we are an at-risk population in so many different areas. So that is our stance, and our presidential cabinet, we are on one accord in supporting the governor and in staying safe. So tonight we have with us a great team of leaders and attorney. We have Attorney Bowers, Attorney Vinson, and Attorney Bolden. We're just so grateful to God to have them with us on tonight. And as they lead us in conversation, you are welcome to utilize the question and answer to pose any questions that you might have, to share with the organization, to share with the entire group tonight. But as they go through the presentation, you are welcome to please share. And let me also say to our group before they get started, they are legal professionals, and I highly encourage you. The Bible says there's safety in a multitude of counselors. I highly recommend that you connect, if not with them, but to get legal counsel and make certain that when you're doing things as a church or your nonprofit, whatever it may be, that you got good counsel of people you know, so that it's not just an emergency, you have to go find somebody, but you have someone you're in relationship with. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to the team. I think Attorney Bowers, I think you are leading the conversation. I know the whole team's working towards it, so I'm going to put it in your hands and let you guys introduce yourself and take us from there.
Hey, everyone. It's good to be with you one more time. I'm excited tonight. I've had the opportunity to serve many of you, and y'all thought I was so smart on my own. But the secret to my success is the dynamic duo that you haven't had a chance to meet. So as we get started tonight, first thing I want to do briefly is just allow everyone to introduce themselves. I will go, and then ask Lakai to go, and then Lawrence. So again, my name is Walter Bowers. I'm a managing partner with Wood & Bowers Vinson. I'm also pastoring at Ebenezer Baptist Church, Steel Creek, which is a plant from our Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Dr. Lynch serves as our senior pastor. So I always like to start off presentations like this to let people know that long before I was an attorney, long before I did really anything, I've been in the family of faith. And as we like to say, Baptist born, Baptist bred, and when I die, Baptist dead, right? So what does that mean? So when we talk to you, we're certainly talking from a legal perspective, but I understand church. I love church. My father's a pastor, right? This is who I am. So even when we have tough sayings, if you will, just not coming from a legal perspective, but also coming from a place as a person of faith. We all happen to be. Lawrence is a PK as well, so we love the people of God and things of that nature. Lakai, tell them a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you, Walter. I am Attorney Vinson. I am a North Carolinian, born and bred. I practice personal injury, but the firm does all types of civil litigation. I have been practicing for 12 years. I am unfortunately not a PK like Walter and Lawrence, but because both of them are, you know that they keep me in check. So thank you all for being here and sharing in this with us this evening. And we certainly hope that we'll have an opportunity to answer all of your questions that you may have. And in the event that we're unable to, feel free to reach out to us after the presentation.
All right.
Good evening, everybody. Lawrence Wooden, Vinson, Wooden Bowers and Vinson. Excuse me. We just came together, so we're getting that to be able to roll off the tongue. I've been practicing for 6 years now, and as Attorney Vinson stated, we do all types of civil litigation, including employment, personal injury, and other business-related litigation. We also handle estate planning And then Walter does a lot with the church bylaws and constitution, as probably many of you have seen him travel around this state, visiting churches and giving them guidance on how to properly set up the bylaws and constitutions. So as was stated, we'd be glad to help you, and we hope you enjoy this presentation.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and get this party started. If at any time, Attorney Vincent or Attorney Wooden, if you can't see my screen or we have some type of technical issue, please let me know. We're going to go ahead. North Carolina has reopened, and today we'll be talking about what that means for your business, place of employment, and place of worship. And Attorney Vincent is going to lead us over some of the topics that we're going to talk about today, and then we're just going to roll right in.
All right, so we are going to go through a few topics today, and certainly feel free to ask questions at the end of each topic, and we'll do our best to answer those. If we run out of time, then like I said, feel free to contact us after today. So first, we're going to talk about the requirements to open businesses during phase 1 and now going into phase 2 of reopening, the recommendations that we're making for all businesses and restrictions and prohibitions on certain businesses within phase 2. We'll talk about the Family First Coronavirus Response Act. We'll talk specifically, which we know is very important to you all today, places of worship. We'll also talk about employee rights, what rights they have as it relates to going back to work, and small business loans, which we know also affects the churches greatly. So first, we're going to talk about phase 2 requirements. The anticipation based on Governor Cooper's announcement yesterday was that we are going into phase 2 starting tomorrow. And the anticipation was that restaurants, bars, fitness center, personal care services such as barbershops, places to get your nails done, and other miscellaneous businesses will open. Now, what happened is the governor said that he would continue to watch the trend of coronavirus cases, and based on that, he would make a determination as we went into phase 2 as to whether or not he'd be opening all of those particular businesses, or if he would restrict those to a few. So restaurants, there's anticipating they're opening, and they will be opening starting tomorrow, but they will be at 50% capacity. The bars and fitness centers, although it was anticipated that they would open, they are not opening. We'll see if, and we anticipate that they'll be opening in phase 3. Personal care services, so where you're able to go and get your hair cut and get your eyebrows done and get your manicures and pedicures, those will certainly be opening within phase 2. And miscellaneous businesses that you don't necessarily think about. So for example, a non-retail store, but maybe a florist would fall in the category of a miscellaneous business. They are allowed to open in phase 2. We also anticipated that churches would be able to open at phase 2, and we'll get into a little bit of that as we progress within this presentation about the litigation that's gone on with churches and where it's left them at this point. Entertainment venues as well was anticipated to open up in phase 2. That is also one that has been concerning, that they're not necessarily lifting up at this point. The governor has suggested that we should not gather in groups of more than 10, certainly when it relates to being indoors. So I know that we have extended family. We want to get together around this particular holiday, but the recommendation is, in order for us to socially distance and to make sure that we're safe, that we should not have more than 10 indoors for any gathering. Public playgrounds were also anticipated to be opening. They are not opening at this time. And they are also asking that we continue the rigorous restrictions on nursing homes just because of the vulnerability of the elderly. So those particular nursing homes, while you may be able to visit those nursing homes, they're still asking that these nursing homes follow rigorous restrictions so that we can make sure that we're not making our most vulnerable population susceptible to COVID. So as I talked about, phase 2 begins tomorrow with certain safeguards. The first one is that we are limiting the amount of customers that are in retail stores, for example. They're allowed to have individuals in these stores as long as they're at 50% of fire capacity. So if there's no fire capacity, if they're not aware of their fire capacity, there's a limit of 12 customers per 1,000 square feet of the business total square footage. As far as social distancing is concerned, they are encouraging it and requiring social distance. We must maintain 6 feet, not only between the customers within the stores, but as well as the customers to employees and the employees to employees. So one of the recommendations that is made is to mark it up, make it obvious, put in your store where the customer should stand from the employees, where the employees should stand from each other, but make it clear so that there's no confusion about how or where you need to be in order to make sure you're maintaining that social distance.
And that's a great point, Lakai. One of the things we wanted to share is that as we share the information, perhaps you may or may not be a business owner, or you may or may not be an employer, but there's a great probability that somebody that you pastor, somebody that looks up to you, may fall into this category. And I also want you to pay careful attention, because you will see some of the information that Attorney Vincent is sharing right now. As they say on the test, you'll see that question again, because it's kind of similar to what we'll have to do when we get into the church specific conversation as well.
Thank you, Walter. And I certainly don't want to steal Attorney Bauer's thunder, because he'll talk specifically about churches. When we talk about cleaning, that's something that's very important, and it's required under Governor Cooper's mandate. It requires that any hand sanitizer that's within these businesses, it must contain 60% alcohol. So you want to make sure that any hand sanitizer that you're potentially making or purchasing, it has at least a 60% alcohol content, so that it's absolutely killing germs. Also, to the extent that there's soap, there are places in which customers can dry their hands, you want to make sure that there's soap and hand drying materials at each one of those stations. Employees that are coming to work, they should be screened daily. So go ahead and adopt a responsive plan, adopt a preventative plan, have certain questions in place that you're going to ask employees as they come to work each day. Consider taking their temperature, asking who they've been around, so that you know what the potential exposure is. Also, as it relates to the customers that are coming into any place that they are shopping at, put them on notice. Make sure you let them know if you're requiring that they wear masks, make sure that you have a sign stating that they must wear their mask before they come in. Likewise, if you're requiring them to have a temperature check before they come into the store, make sure you put them on notice about that. Make sure you tell them about the social distancing requirements, because we certainly want to make sure that the customers know what the expectation is before they come into that store, and so it will not create any additional confusion as long as you make that clear.
All right, thank you.
And if I could just expound on this a little bit, when I talk about adopting a responsive plan, if something happens, if an employee comes to work and says, hey, I had my husband or my wife who's also in the house with me, I believe they've been exposed, I believe that because of that, I may be exposed, make sure that you have adopted a plan before that takes place. Make sure that you're encouraging them to quarantine. They take the recommended time away from their business or from your business, so that you don't potentially expose any customers. So
and
let's talk about, I'm sorry, go ahead,
sorry.
Walter.
I fat fingered it. I apologize. Let me see if I can go back. I said you had a question that came up. It was the type of business was specifically regarding summer camps, and whether or not churches would be able to open those. I had some information on that. I didn't know if you had some, so I'll give you a first stab at it. But the question was, would a church be able to open its summer camp?
Yeah, so I'll give just a little bit of information and then I'll let Walter get into more detail as he's specifically talking about churches. But yes, you will be able to open your summer camp, but there are CDC guidelines that summer camps must follow, just like schools may follow. We know that schools are held sometimes at churches. So you have to make sure that you are following those guidelines and recommendations that are part of the CDC information that they put out there. So you just want to make sure that you do your research, you're following that, because of course, if you don't follow it, it subjects you to litigation, which we will talk about later on in our presentation.
Thank you. Ditto. You answered that. That's exactly what I had. Just following the CDC guidelines, and then the only other guideline that you may be aware of will be the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. Any of those guidelines that you probably are already following if you're running a camp. So that's great. That's good stuff. I'd also like to encourage others. We received that question through the Q&A messaging. So technology is our friend. So feel free to throw those questions in, and we'll certainly be able to jump on them as they come up.
Let me just add one thing.
Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Just one thing on the camps. I was looking at it as well. And one of the major components in North Carolina, at least from the governor's office, is churches can have camps, but you still must be able to have that 6 feet of distance between the campers, just like customers and other businesses. I haven't really. So with that being said, you need to create a plan if you're going to have a church of how that's going to go. Because that's a new requirement. I've never seen a place where kids can be kept 6 feet apart. So, and then also there's no sports that's going to be allowed at the camps unless it's some type of sport where they can maintain that type of distance. So those are some specifics from the CDC and some of the North Carolina guidelines that, you really need to be aware of when trying to decide if you're going to continue to have your camp this summer.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And then I'll kick it back over to Attorney Vincent. I think that's hard. I think one of the things we want to talk about in this conversation is like that's it's some of the stuff that you're hearing that is just that's tough. And then also you got to think about the fact this stuff changes quite frequently. We have to look at it every day. For example, we did this presentation for some other individuals in the state, and a couple of hours later, days later, some of the guidance changed as it relates to phase 2. So Attorney Wooden is absolutely right. And that's hard if I'm trying to entertain kids, right? And I can't do certain activities, but we'll also have to monitor it to see if it gets stricter or if it loosens up. So I certainly appreciate that. Attorney Vincent, did you have something you wanted to add?
So we've kind of gone through this with talking about the requirements, but let's just talk briefly about the recommendations that has been made during phase 1. And this stands during phase 2 as well. When it comes to working, some businesses are opening, they're requiring their employees to come in. To the extent that you can avoid having employees come in, do so. They are recommending that you promote telework and limit non-essential travel. So unless an employee has to travel, try and prevent them from doing so. Don't encourage it by any means. Social distancing, we talked about that. We talked about how difficult that is when it comes to kids, but I mean, it's certainly difficult when it comes to adults as well. To encourage that, you want to limit face-to-face meetings. So do like we're doing today, have webinars, have Zoom meetings. But if you have to do a face-to-face meeting, then have no more than 10 employees in a room together. And if they are together, make them wear face coverings. They may not have face coverings available, so make them available for your employees. Promote good hygiene, hand washing, hand sanitizer. Make sure that you have that available for any of your employees so that they can have access to that at any point that they need it. Provide accommodations for workers who are high risk, who have severe illnesses. So if you know someone is part of the compromised class, don't have them come into a meeting when you know that there are 10 employees that are going to be there. You just want to limit their exposure to the extent that you can do so. Have that person call in, have that person appear by Zoom. Make sure that you have an open door policy with your employees. Make them feel comfortable to be able to communicate to you that they're sick or they've been exposed to someone who may be sick. And if they have been, again, encourage them to stay home, encourage them to follow the CDC guidelines, make sure they quarantine themselves for 14 days, make sure they're not experiencing any symptoms, and make sure that you encourage them to get tested before you have them come back to work. Make sure that to the extent you have access to CDC information, 211 and the Hope for North Carolina helpline, give that information to your employees. Make sure you share that information with them so in the event that they're experiencing any symptoms, they're aware of these resources and they can reach out to them.
And this is one of those places where Attorney Vincent is giving some guidance that was given to all business where, well, guess what? All of these absolutely apply to our churches. Again, we'll get into that momentarily, but when we have this good stuff on the screen, I don't want you to miss it because you think, oh, that doesn't apply to me. All of this applies because at church, most of our churches, we don't have a lot of employees, right? But what we do have are quite a few volunteers. Absolutely everybody there is a volunteer, including some of our deacon leadership, our trustee leadership, our ministers, so on and so forth. So guess what? When they're going to, we should be promoting Zoom calls instead of coming face to face. We should be promoting hygiene when they come to volunteer. All of these factors that she laid out, these are the factors, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But I hope that you're seeing how it is in some ways it's the same, across the board. So thank you, Attorney Vincent. Attorney Whitten, anything in there before we go forward?
No, I don't have anything else, Walter.
Great. All right. So let's push forward. All right. So this is some fun stuff as we shift the topic a little bit. As an employee, what are my rights? That's a great question, right? So as an employee, so one of the things that we want to talk about, because this comes up, that individuals have contacted us, some of your parishioners, if you will, have said, hey, can I refuse to go to work? What are my rights? And so similarly, what you'll find is that OSHA continues to be our guide as it relates to workplace safety as one of the places, in addition to county and state resources. But if an employee is in fear of risk or death or serious injury, first and foremost, you should talk to your employer. Then secondly, you absolutely have a right to file a concern with OSHA. Again, this would be applicable to churches just as it would anywhere else. If I'm working at your church as the custodian and I am concerned that, hey, I don't have enough stuff to clean up after people here. I don't have enough protection, right? How should I address that? So that's something that you should think about. And then ask then if the employer fails to take certain actions and you stop working in good faith, these are some things that are allowed in accordance with the law when there isn't enough time to seek an alternative recourse. It's essentially saying in an emergency situation, you could have a right to refuse to go to work. But Attorney Whitten and I we had talked about this not long ago. Feelings, how do you say it? Feelings are very subjective, right? You just, kind of talk about it a little bit as it relates to if I just don't feel like doing what I'm getting paid to do in the middle of this COVID because I'm afraid. What does that look like?
So, there's two different ways to look at it. You have objectivity and subjectivity. So objectivity is those issues or things in which any one of us can potentially look at and determine if something is being done incorrectly or correctly. Subjectivity, again, is your feeling. So if we all go to a place of a business and we can all see that they're not cleaning, they're not wearing masks, they're not wearing gloves, whereas clearly a reasonable person can see that they're not doing the things following the guidelines. Whereas if a business potentially is, and you just afraid because the virus is out there, but that's your internal feelings, you can't just not go to work for that reason. The job is doing everything they can to keep the risk low, and you're saying, well, I still don't feel comfortable. That's not enough. One thing we discussed before is keep a good line of communication between yourself and the employer, or if you're the employer and the employee, about what's needed to ensure that you have a healthy work environment in this new normal, if you will. And you have to keep a healthy line of communication. But it's just important that you just don't say, I can't go because I don't feel comfortable. There are guidelines in place for employees in which going to work may not be feasible, but you cannot just state, I don't feel comfortable. That's not enough to keep you from going to work.
Right. And thank you. And the last guideline here reminds us to do what? You certainly document everything that you are experiencing and exposed to at the workplace. But that goes both ways. So if you are an employer, we encourage you to document. What are we talking about? You should probably, it's a good time, even at your church, honestly, to log, who, what, when, where, and why as it relates to cleaning, right? That's the only way you can ensure that cleaning is happening on a timely basis, especially for those of you who have a facility that, whether it's your business or if you have a facility that's set aside for the public, such as a daycare, you absolutely should be doing certain things and documenting how you are in compliance with the guidelines. And as an employee, of course, if you find a situation where guidelines are not being followed, you want to document those as well. All right. So listen, so the money question, it always goes down to the money, right? Isn't everything about the money? Somebody asked the question, will I still be paid if I don't go to work because of health concerns? And the answer comes from OSHA, not necessarily. Again, they don't obligate the employers to pay their employees if they refuse to work, even if the claim is justified, right? And then the other question was, can I get unemployment if I choose to be laid off? And the most famous lawyer answer of all times is simply, it depends, right? And so this is certainly one of those cases where you would absolutely want to talk to wise counsel before you decide not to go to work. You would certainly want to talk to someone before you decide that you're not going to do something or even apply for unemployment. Lawrence is going to get into a little bit more of that momentarily in the portion of his presentation. There are some exceptions to the general rule as it relates to the employer getting off the hook from paying you, and we'll go over those momentarily. But some of the guidelines that you see here consist of the fact that there may be some protection when the workplace temporarily shuts down or the employee is quarantined. But again, I'm going to allow Attorney Wooden to go over that in his presentation in a moment, because there were some specific laws that were passed that you need to be aware about. Before I do that, Attorney Vincent, was there anything else that we needed that you wanted to share? And I also have a question. So Attorney Vincent, I want to make sure I didn't miss you, and then I'm going to go to a question that we have.
Nope, I'm all good to go. And I was just actually typing back to Mr. Dennis Jr., who just asked the question. Is that the questions you are also referring to?
Yes. Let's see. Oh, the struggle is single mothers in an undeserved community have to go back to work or lose their job and do not have a place to take their children. The summer camps have been their place. That is the tension in the decision. It's like the essential workers. What is the liability if someone gets sick if the CDC guidelines are being followed? That's a great question. We'll come to that in a moment because it's going to answer that ultimate question of, can I be sued? All right, so we're going to certainly come back to that question. So I'm going to type great question so that the system will know I did respond. But the real answer is coming momentarily, because that will speak to several questions that have been presented as well. All right, so let's see, push forward here. All right, again, so we talked about it. This is just reiterating. There's no new information on this slide. It's just a repeat. But what we want to talk about again, this is just a rehash of how you can file a complaint, how the OSHA process works. If you file a complaint, the OSHA will review your complaint. If it's valid, they will take the appropriate measures, including inspections, and require the employer to be compliant. And these are the step-by-step guides as it relates to what you should do as an employee if you feel that you have any concerns. I highlighted some of those, but these are just the bullets in order in case anyone needed those. And I certainly will work with Dr. Barr to make sure that you guys have a copy of these as needed. All right. So again, segue, and I'm going to turn it over to. Well, before I do that, we had another question to come in. The question was, I had a member that told me their job asked them to volunteer not to work. Do they get unemployment? Oh, wow. Employers have, I'm gonna open this up to all of us. Employers have an amazing way with words. I guess what they were asking them to do was to be laid off. And of course, if you are laid off, yes, you certainly can get unemployment. And honestly, if that employer was trying to take care of the employee, it's in this season, the best thing that employer could do was just lay the individual off. And there's certainly funds out there. Lawrence or Kai, anything y'all want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just gonna say the same thing. I mean, I don't know with that without understanding the full context of that statement. It's hard to give a response to that. Employees need to be careful in if they respond or do act on something from that type of request, because when you get laid off and you file for unemployment, the government sends a notice to the employer and says, hey, this person filed for unemployment. Can you verify that they work there? Can you verify that they didn't quit? Can you verify that they weren't fired for one of the statutory reasons that you can be fired for and not get unemployment? And so if you quit, you can't get unemployment. So it's very important that an employee does not make a decision like that from an employer without talking to someone first, because they can potentially risk not getting unemployment if they voluntarily leave work, which in a sense is quitting. So that's like Walter said, they're being funny with the words, but that can have financial impact on the employee.
Attorney Benson, anything you want to add to that?
I just add to make sure that you document these conversations. I know in the moment you believe that you're going to remember what was said, but as both Attorney Bowers and Attorney Wooden, said, it can be very tricky when it comes to these words. And so you want to make sure that you properly document what's been shared with you by your employer, so that if it comes down to this and it's a he said, she said, it certainly puts you in a better position when you've documented close in time than trying to remember it weeks or days later.
Right. Thank you. All right. So we're segueing over to something that we need you all to be fully aware of, again, not only for yourselves, but for those that you minister to. Attorney Wooden is going to kind of take us briefly through this Family First Coronavirus Response Act and its legal considerations for the business owner. And of course, it may be applicable to you as a pastor as well in some capacities.
Okay, so the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, FFCRA, is the second, I think, major piece of federal legislation that was passed in wake of this impact of this virus. Essentially, it applies to employers with 500 or fewer employees. It expands the Family Medical Leave Act protections until December at the end of this year. So what you get is 2 weeks of paid sick leave at 2/3 of the employees' regular rate, and then additional 10 weeks of paid sick leave at 2/3 of the employee's regular rate. You can also get 2 weeks of paid sick leave at the employee's regular rate if that employee has the coronavirus. Okay, so you go to the next slide. And so, again, in order for this to apply, this is kind of the 6 different factors that will allow a person to qualify for this expanded FMLA time. If the person is subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order, they have been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine, they're experiencing COVID-19 symptoms and is seeking a medical diagnosis, is caring for an individual subject to an order described in the first statement, or self-quarantine, or described in the second statement. They're caring for a child whose school has closed or place of care is closed, or they're experiencing any other substantially similar condition specified by the Secretary of Health and Human Services. All right, and so these different factors apply is for people who are trying to keep their job but cannot go to work because of COVID. Okay, So if you have a job and you have COVID, then your job is there. You get 2 weeks and 14 days of paid sick leave at your full rate. Then you can have an additional 10 weeks at 2/3 the rate. If you're caring for a child, you can have 10 weeks of at 2/3 the rate of paid sick leave. If you're the employer, you get a credit, a tax credit for these for having to pay for these additional benefits, because the FMLA didn't apply to many small businesses because they didn't have enough employees. And so because COVID has impacted small businesses more so than the large ones, the government provided these tax credits for the business owners and allowed the employees to maintain their jobs. All right. Anything you want me to add on that?
Yeah. No, I think that's good. Any questions on that? Before we slide into the to the next subject. All right, we'll keep pressing forward. All right, so here we are. So what about places of worship? Let's talk about it. Again, in regards to places of worship, as we just talked about, things change rapidly. You all are aware at this point of the litigation that was filed in regards to the church's right to assemble. And I am proud to say amongst my colleagues, I'm sure they agree with me, that without a doubt, and that the First Amendment is tough. We've certainly done some First Amendment litigation in court recently, and that First Amendment is a bear. And as it relates to some of those powers that are First Amendment, it's tough. Now I've seen, and in a second I'm going to shift to the other part. But what I'm talking about from the legal perspective is this, that it was going to be really hard once stores and businesses started opening up. I understand the science behind it. I'm not even saying I disagree with the science. I understand the science behind the fact that it's different perhaps to be moving in a shopping mall or something in comparison to sitting in a church building. I understand the science. But as the judge on that particular case said, there is no COVID-19 exception to the First Amendment. Now, ask another judge, they may say something different. But for what we're talking about, our church, my church, is certainly probably not any different from you all. While I'm a fan of the First Amendment, and I'm a fan of safety and family more than anything else. Dr. Lynch said something as we put our statement out that blessed me real good when he said that at the end of the day, we as clergy, we're the one that will be responsible and having to stand there at somebody's graveside if we just did what we could instead of doing what we should. And so additionally on this part, from a legal perspective, you absolutely, it's my job as your legal, when I'm talking legally, to tell you, yep, you absolutely have a right to worship just as you did before. A stay means that whenever something like this happens, you can ask for, you can say you have irreparable harm. You can get a temporary relief until there's a full hearing. And that's what we have here until, I believe, May the 29th. I don't foresee anything changing on that date. And so that means that the order regarding the church and the phases regarding the church, the order itself has been stayed. However, my recommendation to you is to continue to follow the CDC guidelines and other guidelines that come from health officials, which go back to, in part, of what Attorney Vinson was speaking to as it relates to certain protocols. While our church, for example, has not opened and is not, we don't have a date, we're working on protocols. There are a lot of protocols. There are a lot of emails floating around, and they're all good. But I would say those protocols start with training. Right? If you're not training your volunteers, I don't care how good your stuff is. I don't care how many masks you have. If you don't train a person on how to properly wear a mask, right? If you don't train a person how to properly remove the mask from the box, I got COVID all over my hand and I just stuck my whole hand in the box, talking about being safe. Guess what I've just done, right? So training is essential, is paramount for what we do. And then the protocols. If you have pew seating, it's going to be a little bit different. But I've seen some churches that have started the process, but how are you going to mark that 6 feet of difference, right? If you have seats standard, maybe fold up seats is maybe a little bit easier, but these are the things you got to think about. What about collection, right? We certainly want to continue that. But what does that look like? How can you reduce the number of times something has to be touched? And the list goes on and on. Sharing microphones. These are the type of things that, again, that are not necessarily legal yet. Hint, hint, wink, wink. I'll tell you what I mean by that in a moment. But these are guidelines, right? Because my third bullet is, and certainly if Dr. Barr or others don't, they're copious. We're following our guidelines from other pastors, and the CDC put out a 17-page guideline about a week ago. And those guidelines are really thorough. So certainly we could just share those links if you don't have them. But the reason I said that these are not legal considerations yet is because my third bullet was a question that has been raised. Can my church or business be sued if someone contracts the coronavirus? So as we address that in a moment, I think there was another question up top. Let me see if it falls in this. Going back. So Lawrence, you want to answer that question? It was a question about the FFCRA.
Yeah. Yep. And so to answer your question, yes. Does the FFCRA apply to small business, 500 or fewer, whereas the FMLA refers to larger businesses? So what the FFCRA does is expands the FMLA to smaller businesses, but also expands the FMLA. But the FFCRA does not apply to those with 500 or more. The reason being, if they're a large company, they already have sick leave in place. If you recall, FMLA on its own just allowed you to have 12 weeks of unpaid leave, but you maintain a hold on your job. Now what they're saying is they're mandating you allowed to get paid if you're a smaller business, but it doesn't apply to larger businesses. That those expansions don't apply to those with 500 or more employees. And again, the reason behind that in the legislation, whether you agree with it or not, is because most employers, large employers, have sick leave and vacation time and whatnot that employees can use.
All right. Thank you for the question. All right. So moving forward. So can my church or business be sued? Grandma got the virus, and is the church responsible for it? Let's talk about it.
Well, before you get to the answer, I know Attorney Vincent gonna come with a great answer. Before she gets to the answer, for those who don't know, there were two churches recently, one in California on Mother's Day, where a woman went on Mother's Day, had a Mother's Day service. Woman got tested on that Monday. Potentially 180 people were then impacted potentially by that. And then another one, I believe, in Arkansas. And both of those churches have now closed. They're saying, well, we're not going to open up again because of that. So I just wanted to preface before we get the answer to that question that, what's currently happening in real time as we go through this.
All right. Attorney Vincent, we're going to bring you in with a drum roll. Can my church or business be sued? Can they sue the good right Reverend Dr. Bowers? Because he opened up church. Let's see what they're talking about here. All right.
So that is the $1 million question. And in short, the answer is yes. I mean, we all know, we see individuals that are sued on a routine basis that are wrongfully convicted. Yes, you can be sued, but what we want to do is talk about how we can limit your exposure for potential liability. So the first challenge that any plaintiff, and that's the person who's bringing the lawsuit against a business or a church, is proving where COVID was contracted. So, for example, there was a young lady that had COVID, and there were a bunch of individuals who also had COVID, and they traced them back to a debit machine at Walgreens. Well, in that case, they were able to trace it back. They were able to determine where COVID was contracted. But that is certainly a difficult task for any potential plaintiff to prove, especially if they've not social distanced, if they've gone to many businesses, to determine and prove where COVID was initially contracted. So that's the first thing that they must prove. Again, that makes it easier if they go to church and they're there with 150 other church members, and the 150 members also contract COVID after they understand that they've been exposed to this one person that was in church that was symptomatic and potentially spread COVID to all of those other church members.
Hey, Lakai, that's very powerful. You said something that just came to me, and then we also had a couple questions that came in. How many of you are aware, maybe by show of hands or something, if you could use that feature, that, believe it or not, one of the things they said, one of the fastest growing industries, and I don't remember the exact term, they call them, is it called tracers or contact tracers, where essentially now that they're employing people now, they're primarily being employed to trace back where somebody was infected for health reasons. But how easy would that be for the clever lawyer to subpoena those same records that they used to trace back, to say, see, I told you it originated at your church because the evidence showed it back. And so then if it does originate at your church or your business, which could happen, then as Attorney Vincent is talking about, and they're going to say, show us your cleaning records, show us your training, show us what you did to do these things. So thanks.
Attorney Bowers, I don't know if you saw, you had about 7 hands to go up in response to that question. Also, there's another question that came through through the chat. It asked from Leroy Anderson, what criteria do you suggest for selecting a good insurance company? And if this is not the right time for that question, we can defer it to later.
Yeah, I was super quick on that one. Speaking from putting a pastor hat on, I think many of us use different ones. I'm not trying to give them any extra business or take it away, because I've heard pros and cons, but most of us use a lot of the different ones, same ones such as Church Mutual and things of that nature. We personally have not had any challenges, but I've heard others have. I think the best thing for us to do is to that's a great question, and maybe something Dr. Barr would allow us to discuss at one of our next sessions, or even have some of those reps to come to talk about, what they will cover, what they won't cover. Because one of the things that we talk about when we talk about the top 10 legal issues in the church is that many of us have inadequate insurance. It's not that it wouldn't have covered you, but you didn't pay for a certain type of coverage. Your coverage didn't cover the fact that you rent out your facility to everybody in the community and you thought it did. Your coverage didn't cover everybody driving the church van and you thought it did. You could have paid for that rider or anything, whatever the case may be, but you didn't cover that. And it's a case-by-case basis, but certainly something that's a good question. I think we could probably get into that a little bit more, but that's one of the ones of many that are out there. But that's a really good question. A couple of other questions that came in. What constitutes proper cleaning? We're not cleaning experts, but I'll let Attorney Vincent talk about that as it relates to guidelines and stuff. And maybe Attorney Wooden has some questions on it. But that is actually a good question, because just because you say it's clean, is it actually clean? Clean. Attorney Vincent, you have anything on that?
Yeah, so I would encourage you, one, which we talked a little bit about earlier, is to make sure that you're using any sanitizer within your particular church that has 60% alcohol. 2, to make sure you're doing daily cleanings. We're not talking about the fact that we've already mentioned that you may potentially expose yourself to liability, but you certainly want to put yourself in the best position possible. So sure, you can clean once a week, but if you have records that show you're cleaning daily every time someone enters the church, then it certainly puts you in a different position than if you're cleaning weekly after members have been there every day of the week. So while there's no certain guidance, there's no absolute requirement that you clean daily, you certainly want to put yourself in the best position possible so that it limits your potential exposure. So 1, make sure that you are sanitizing those areas that are high traffic areas in the church. Make sure that you're cleaning those areas every time you have members or you're inviting individuals into that church. And 3, make sure you're documenting it every time a cleaning takes place, so that if you're ever subject to any sort of litigation, you have those records clear, and it makes it very difficult for them to show that you were negligent, which is the second part of my potential liability slide, is that any plaintiff that's suing you must show that you were negligent by failing to protect the customer, or in this case, members. So for example, you don't have any social distance guidelines within the church. you're allowing your sick employees are in churches, volunteers to come in, or 3, that there is a lack of cleaning. And by lack of cleaning, it can also mean negligent cleaning. So again, document very clearly what you do, how often you do it, and what you use to clean those areas, so that if there is a member that comes into that church that has COVID, they can't say that the reason that they caught COVID was because that you negligently cleaned your church area or any high frequent area in the church.
That's
And
powerful. Go ahead.
I was just going to add to that. Make sure that, because this is constantly changing, evolving, make sure you're constantly checking the CDC guidelines on cleaning, your state health department guidelines, and then also your local city or county health department guidelines. Sometimes the local guidelines may be more strict than the national ones. So they may, they may have some guidelines on there. I would also say, because somebody was talking about insurance, if you have a carrier who will cover this type of claim, they may have certain requirements that you must do to make sure that you're covered under that claim. So check with your carrier as well, your insurance carrier.
That's great. And I've got a great question that came up. It's just one same individual, but he has 2-part question. Should a church keep record of those attending services for contact tracking purposes, and should guidelines be posted? I'll answer the easy one first. Yes, please post your guidelines, and that's always good to post the guidelines for the parishioners and certainly for your volunteers. That is always in order. Now, I want to fight with my counterparts on this. The other question: should a church keep record of those attending services for contact tracing purposes? I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth on this question, right? Here's the thing, right? From a health perspective, health matters more than anything else, right? You gotta have health. And so it's good to be able to help the CDC if somebody were to be impacted. So you can say, this is who was there. That's real good. That's what we do. The other side of me, though, is that, again, I've been in church my whole life. Most of us are terrible at record keeping, or it's not consistent, right? And if your records are not consistent and you have another record that you're having to keep up with, and that thing meaning that at some point, depending on the size of your church, somebody had to be responsible every Sunday for taking the roll or writing those names down, and you need to be consistent with that, because something that can look real negligent is inconsistent records. You might not have done anything, but your records look so bad. So that's why I'm talking out of both sides. You're right. If somebody got sick, they put you on the news for being the hero who took the name of everybody that came into his church, and they would sing praises to your name for doing that. But on the flip side, that one Sunday when Sister Mary was on duty, and she just didn't take all the names, she couldn't hardly spell, and or whatever the case may be, and your records are not there, that's the problem, right? We see the same thing with Constitution and bylaws, where people have so many different documents and so many different operating procedures that is not consistent when it comes to our record keeping. And so your church may be some great record keepers. So from a health side, that's a home run. But on the other side, I'm just, man, I ain't seen, so what do y'all think? What do y'all think about it?
So I think that you want to err on the side of caution. We understand that, one, we're talking about privacy concerns. Some individuals just do not want you asking information about who they are, what they've been involved with, who they've been exposed to. But we want to put you in the best situation to expose liability as it relates to the church. So when it comes to liability, we want you to ask those questions. We want you to keep a list. And when you keep that list, ask each one of those individuals, have you been around anyone that has been exposed to corona? Have you been out of the country? We all know we get those whenever we go into a doctor's office. So make sure you follow that protocol. On top of it, we know and we understand that it's one more list to have to keep up with, but again, we want to make sure that you're in the best position possible. And so if you can produce that list in the event that you're sued, it puts you in a much better position to show that you have done everything that you can and that you haven't been negligent in trying to make sure that you cross all T's and dot all I's to prevent any of your members or visitors from contracting COVID.
So let me just add to that. I don't disagree with Attorney Vincent. I will just look at it from a different angle from since we're talking to mainly churches here. And I agree, if you're a small business, definitely, you want to keep that. Maybe a small church can, from a feasibility standpoint, if you're a church that has, 150 members and up, at both services and whatnot, you know, is it feasible to maintain, to have those type of records, to take, have a questionnaire for everybody to fill out every time they come for service? Or would it be sufficient to post those questions as guidelines, around the church property, so that you can inform people of why they would need to not come to church that day if any of those questions aren't answered yes. Would that be
Well,
something,
look,
Attorney Vincent?
I'm sorry, you done?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, see, now this is why I take my lawyer hat all the way off, because I can't disagree with y'all from a legal perspective, but I just know how people do it. I'm telling you, that's the afraid. I mean, they're not right, they're not wrong, and it's good, but I'm just telling you, you're gonna do it, and it becomes that feasibility. The larger your church is, it could be a challenge. It could be a real challenge. So that's good stuff, though. All right, that's good stuff. All right, so
I agree. I think it would be, from a precaution standpoint, Attorney Vince is 100%. It's just a feasibility matter. And somebody just had a question about waivers. I don't know if I saw it went away. I know we've talked about that before, and that's a whole nother discussion. But having a waiver, I'll just say, does not keep you immune from a lawsuit. I guess that's the way I'll put it. Simply having a waiver doesn't keep you immune from a lawsuit.
Right. All right, great. That's good stuff. Thank you for the dialogue. Let's move forward for the sake of time. We don't want to keep you all too long, and we want to make sure that we hit all of the questions that we possibly can.
Attorney Bowers?
Yes, sir.
We had one more question that came through chat.
Okay.
Reverend Whitehead. He asked, is one's right to worship privately, or I'm just trying to restate the question. One has the right to worship privately, and can their names be shared? So I guess the summation of the question is, do we have the right, once we take a list of who's there, do we have the right to post that? Should we do it? Should we not do it?
The easy part of it, I always like to pick the easy part of a difficult questions out. The easy part is certainly, doubt you shouldn't share information. Period. You shouldn't even be sharing your who's a member of your church, really. And why? One reason that comes up is domestic violence, and also some of your youth. You'd be surprised who is a foster child that attends your church. I've seen these situations real world on more than one occasion, especially when it comes to the students, where maybe they were there with a foster parent, because foster parents often take the student with them wherever they go worship, and maybe they're in protective custody, and some other relative who wants them or is looking for them, too much information is posted publicly, then that could be problematic. And the same with restraining orders. I've seen that as well. Seen a season where we actually had to have some of those restraining orders in where we can readily get to them, because that's just the real world. So I would say on the easy part, we shouldn't be sharing information, period. I certainly would. I'm not sure if he was going there, but if a parishioner was to show up who said, I'm not comfortable sharing my information or putting my name down, I would, it certainly would be up to that place of worship, in my opinion, if they allow that person to proceed. I would hope they would allow them to continue to worship, but I understand, this is some difficult and unique stuff. Attorney Wooden or Vincent, you got any thoughts on that?
I was just gonna say, if the question came from the comments regarding keeping names, I think Attorney Vincent's comments are related to, if you are sued, you have a track record to show that you did your due diligence in trying to limit your risk of spreading a COVID. So that's all I was going to say. I'll let Attorney Vincent see if she has anything to add.
I don't have anything to add to that particular question, but I wanted to make sure that we address these two questions while we were on this topic. I know there was a question about taking temperatures. I think that falls back in line with keeping a record. Certainly, if you have the ability to take temperatures, then we certainly want to make sure that you do so that as members pass through the door, and you've checked off that they don't have a temperature, again, should anybody subject you to any civil litigation, it puts you in a better position to show that there was no negligence on your behalf. And not taking temperatures is not necessarily negligent right off the bat, but again, you want to put yourself in the best position possible to avoid exposure to liability. The second part, or the second question, was about the secretary and the pastor being the only people in the church and within their offices. I don't necessarily think, and I think that reasonable people would find that if you were in an isolated area of the church working, that you don't necessarily have to clean the church, the whole church, every time you enter and exit. But keep in mind that these cases are decided by individuals, and they have to look at it from a reasonable person standard. Is it reasonable for you to clean the church every time you and your secretary pass through the church and go into your specific offices, work in there, and exit in a particular area of the church? I would argue, as your defense counsel, that it's not, but the argument can certainly be made that as you're passing through the church, you're sneezing, you're coughing. So there's still some potential exposure to the larger area or the main area of the church. And so if someone comes in there thereafter and you haven't cleaned for the whole week that you and your secretary have been in there, then it was negligent for you to do so.
Awesome. All right. So that is that is good. So listen, we're segued. Thank you. And again, I have nothing to add to what Attorney Vincent just said. She was spot on with her analysis. It's all about, taking those steps. And I would say that for a thermometer is a whole lot easier than the roll, if you choose to take a roll, if you will. Because a thermometer, if that person has a temperature, then guess what? You just don't let them in. Right? You just don't. And things of that nature in this season. All right. So briefly, and this is the last part of the presentation. But again, I am aware that some of again, by show of hands, and Dr. Barb, you could help me. How many of you are still having challenges with the Payroll Protection Act, whether that's challenges for your church or challenges for your business? I'm curious because certainly we saw some reports that certain businesses and certain people just weren't the priority. It seems like it's getting better, but I'm curious to know before Attorney Whitten closes us out with this part, because we've kind of talked about problems, we talked about solutions, and so any church or business that may be struggling financially, this is something that's out there, and more things are on the way, or they're trying to work through that politically. But I was curious to see how many of you all were in this, dealing with this particular situation. All right, Attorney Whitten, I'm gonna let you take it and finish us out with this part.
Okay. So small business loans, the third legislation that was passed federally is called the CARES Act, which includes the payroll protection component of the CARES Act, which essentially was passed so that small businesses could keep employees on their payrolls and not have them go on the unemployment rolls and receive unemployment payments. The purpose, the goal was to take your average 2.5 times your average payroll. You would get a loan through your bank and spend that money in 8 weeks and have that money potentially forgiven. The requirements were simply had to spend no less than 75% of the money on payroll costs, no more than 25% on other operating expenses like mortgage, rent, utilities. Okay, it's for businesses with 500 or fewer employees. And then also you can include independent contractors, sole proprietors, i.e. barbers, hairstylists, nail techs, or anyone else who has their own some type of, general contractors and whatnot. If you have your own business and you operate as a sole proprietor 1099, you can partake in this as well. Next slide. And so the lenders include many of your large banks, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, BB&T, JP Morgan Chase, all of the Citigroup, all these large banks, credit unions, local credit unions, And then also for those of you who may bank in a kind of non-traditional methods, if you will, online banking and whatnot, they also have been granted access to provide these loans through the SBA, who is the government entity that's managing this process. And as you see on the screen, there's a very different non-traditional lenders. Some of you may utilize this if you have your own business, but a couple that I'm familiar with, PayPal and Square, that I've used in the past. You should apply to these banks or the lenders. If you get denied by one or they're taking too long, apply to another one. Just yesterday or the day before, I saw there was still close to $100 billion that had not yet been distributed. I read that 12% of the money have gone to African-American owned businesses, 12%. So churches can apply for this money. If you have payroll at your church, you can apply for this money. That's money that can be used. It's not coming out of your operating budget to be used to continue to keep those people on staff. Many churches may have lower donations coming in because of what's going on. So if you can keep people paid, keep people going, those people on your staff, then this is a method. So please apply. If you're not able to get the money forgiven, it's 1% and it must be paid back in 2 years. So you have 1% interest that must be paid back in 2 years. So I definitely recommend you go apply. Like I said, if you go to one bank and they deny you or they're taking too long, go apply to another one so that you can get it. Okay? But this is pretty much what you would call free money from the government for us to keep people employed. Like I said, 12% of the funds have gone to minority African-American owned businesses. So that's a small number when you're talking about over $600 billion of money that's out here for us to remain employed, for us to keep people on our payrolls.
Let's think. Hey, Attorney Wooden, I want to make sure we have any questions on that. I think that was your last slide on that. So look, good questions coming up. So I want to make it real clear. I had 3 questions that came in about the 50% capacity or the capacity 1%. If the capacity is limited to 50 people, it should be easy to keep a roll. This is great. This is why we started out. This is what was so major about that stay being put in place. Churches are no longer our religious services, funerals, weddings, worship are no longer governed by the executive order. So that is out the window, period. Does not mean you should go and get 100 people and go to a funeral. It does not mean that you should get, 100 people and go to worship. But what it means is that anything that would be protected by the First Amendment, they have said that the governor has no say so in that lane, right? This is why you see some people cheering and saying hip hip hooray, and other people are saying, well, I don't maybe want the government making a decision for me, but I am concerned that now people will take this freedom and exercise it carelessly. So for those that were asking about capacity, there is no capacity. For those that were asking about a limit, there is no limit. It's just not the wise thing to do. That's why our recommendation to you is to continue to follow the CDC and state guidelines. In North Carolina, we seem to be doing a pretty good job of running neck and neck with the with the CDC guidelines. If we're not more conservative in some areas than others. I think there was make sure you got all of the questions. Do we have any additional questions or any other additional comments before we close out? I saw some stuff popping up in the chat. I'm not catching that as fast. God bless you. Thank you all. We certainly will. Yes, I will share everything with Dr. Barr and allow him to disseminate that. Some of the information is not, the presentation is ours. The CDC guidelines are not ours, but I will certainly share the link with Dr. Barr or for me to throw.
I think we lost Walter, but he was saying he's going to share the link with you, Dr. Barr, so that everybody can get access to it.
Yeah, thank you. Am I back? Can you hear me now? Okay,
yeah.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Yep, you that was it. So Again, we certainly appreciate your time. We appreciate your comments. Certainly, again, we are here to serve. Again, many of you I worked with in the past, I do this in part because of it's my ministry, but also we do this. This is our business. We take pride in it. Again, we're blessed. Again, Attorney Wooden and I have been together for really 2015, and then we were blessed to take the business to a higher level by adding Attorney Vincent, who also has a world of experience in personal injury, as car accidents and those if you get injured somewhere, and even this type of case would be somewhat personal injury. So she's great. Again, Attorney Wooden, he's masterful in that area, estate planning issues and civil litigation. And certainly, you guys know me. We work together on Constitution and bylaws and as relates to civil litigation and contract matters. So again, we are grateful to serve. We appreciate this opportunity. You could have been anywhere watching Netflix, but you chose to hang out with us. And we appreciate the conversation and the dialogue. Again, on the last slide is our contact information. Again, if you have any questions or anything, please email us because sometimes certain questions can't be answered in a setting like this. We'd have to have a little bit more of a consultation with you, and we're open for that. Just mention that you connected with us through this presentation, and we'll take care of you real good. So at this time, I want to turn it back over to Dr. Barr. I'm going to ask for your prayers. We record our worship service on Thursday nights to play on Sunday. So I got to shift my mind from attorney to preacher. So pray for the old man as we go and prepare for worship. And thank you all for your time. And Dr. Barr, I will shift it over to you, sir.
Thank you so much.
One more thing, Walter, if I could. If you enjoyed this session, please give us a review, Google review or what have you. That helps when people search our name. So please feel free to give us some type of Google review, 5 stars, if you will. Thank you.
Yeah, that'd be real nice.
Amen. Thank you guys again. I wish we could give you a virtual hand applause. You guys have given us so much in such a short amount of time. We appreciate it. Tonight's session was recorded. If you would like to rewatch this session or want to share it with someone you feel like it would be beneficial to, please send an email to gbsconline@gmail.com, gbsconline@gmail.com. Also, if you would like a copy of those CDC guidelines, if you'll send it to that very same address, and I've put it in the chat area a few times. But we had a question or pose there about persons who did not receive PPP, but they used another resource out there, Kabbage, and I know some of you may be familiar, some of you not. I guess the big difference there is the forgivable part of the loan, as well as having a deferment and payment for the first 6 months that you get with the PPP plan. But I agree with Attorney Wooden so much. Try again. Keep hitting. Your smaller banks are probably where you're going to get the greatest traction at this point. The big banks got dinged a little bit for maybe not participating as they should have. But please, man, please serve as much as you can. Access this money that, as long as you follow the guidelines, should be forgiven. But another source is out there. If you need help, you got to go wherever you can. But again, thank you, everyone. Please, again, if you will, if you have any need for the information discussed tonight or want to rewatch the video, send that request to gbsconline@gmail.com. Thank you to our attorney brothers and friends. I have had to utilize their services personally. I personally give them a great recommendation. So let's try to encourage. I encourage all of you, if you need attorneys, that's a great group to talk to. Thank you all again for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
And if we can be of service to you, don't hesitate to reach out. God bless you. Grace and peace.